Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Now that economic sanctions are being used as weapons of mass destruction, we ask, what does this mean for the Russian people and the Russian economy? But much more importantly, what are the implications for the global economy and the global financial system? Those are the issues I shall raise today with the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India and now a professor of finance at Chicago University, Raghuram Rajan. Mr. Rajan, in a recent column that you've written titled Economic Weapons of Mass Destruction, you write, when fully unleashed, sanctions too are weapons of mass destruction. They may not topple buildings or collapse bridges, but they destroy firms, financial institutions, livelihoods, and even lives. Like military WMDs, they inflict pain indiscriminately, striking both the culpable and the innocent. So let me start by asking you, what do these sanctions imposed by the West on Russia mean both for its economy and for its people?
Well, first, they're much wider in scope than we thought was possible before this conflict. So the West has come together, and of course, when we say West, we also mean countries like Japan, which side with advanced countries. And they've put together a package of sanctions which affect not just trade, but also payments, but also the financial sector in fairly significant ways. So they affect every part of the economy. And to that extent, they can essentially inflict a lot of damage. Now, the initial estimates of damage to the Russian economy were about 10% of GDP. In other words, it'll go down by 10%. Now, it's anybody's guess what the true damage will be, because what you can see is a lot of people have stopped doing business with Russian banks, with Russian firms. They've stopped buying their products. Russian firms cannot make certain kinds of investments. They cannot sell certain kinds of goods because they require, for example, advanced chips in them. So the whole damage to the economy is at this point guesswork, but we'll see what happens at the end. Now, this is in reaction to a pretty significant violation of international rules by Russia. So it is not disproportional, but it does cause a lot of damage.
And when damage of this nature is caused, it affects the lives of people, their health, their living standards, their education, their general environment. People also will pay a cost for this in Russia.
Absolutely. And, there are people who can leave. A lot of people have left. There's been a lot of out-migration out of Russia as people have sensed the effect of these sanctions.
But those are only the rich ones.
Those are the rich ones, or the ones that have viable human capital that they can trade in other countries, become software engineers, etc. The people who stay are the people who are facing the full brunt of the sanctions.
And less able to face it because they are poorer.
Almost always. And as a result, the question is, are these the people who caused the problem in the first place? Now, that's a hypothetical, very hard to answer.
But it's an important moral question that has to be asked.
It's an important moral question, because if the people who caused the problem in the first place are the elite, who have the greatest flexibility, the greatest buffers, etc., then they're not paying as much of a price as the poor, unfortunate poor, who are the collateral damage.
This is a very important moral question you raise. But in your article, you also raise several other concerns which arise out of using sanctions as weapons. Let me take you through those. Right. They're not moral, they're more technical, they're more financial, they're more economic. You begin by saying, for starters, the seemingly bloodless nature of economic weapons and the lack of norms governing them could result in their overuse. This could reverse the process of globalization that has allowed the modern world to prosper. For a start, what would the reversal of globalization mean, and how serious a danger is it?
It means we're all poorer. I mean, think about the impediments to globalization that were emerging even before the sanctions. For example, the fight between China and the United States. Each side was imposing higher tariffs on each other's goods, but there was also a growing set of sanctions on cross-border investment. Huawei was being penalized by the US, and in turn, China was putting impediments in the way of US investment in China. So what this means is impediments to producing elsewhere, because you could suddenly see tariffs being placed on the goods if you produce in China and send back to the United States. It implies impediments on cross-border investment, and all this was happening before. Now, every company is going to try and wonder what happens if I invest in that country and that country is unfriendly to mine. And if they start getting anxious about each other, the first way they react is by elevating these economic tools. I impose sanctions on your companies, you impose sanctions on my companies. And as I said, because they seem relatively bloodless, because they're falling on large companies, nobody worries too much. This is not necessarily a bad thing. But of course, it's a bad thing, because then I hesitate to invest in your country. I don't provide jobs in your country, and vice versa. We don't trade with each other as much, and that brings down the total level of globalization, which has been so beneficial for
This
the
is
global
what
economy.
you mean when you wrote in your essay, inevitably, economic interactions between countries will shrink. And what this also means is a sort of, if I can call it that, beggar my neighbor strategy ends up beggaring me as well.
Exactly. But it's because of the nature of this kind of sanction. It's very hard to predict who it falls on. Could it be me? Because there's this element of dissatisfaction between our countries. It could be a border dispute. It could be even a dispute of values. You're an authoritarian country, I'm a democratic country. So we're going to fight over things.
Absolutely. And I'll come to that point about how it might even be a dispute about values rather than a dispute about territory or a dispute about land.
Right.
I'll come to that in a moment's time. But let me take up another concern that you mentioned in that essay. One particularly worrying consequence you point out is that countries might start exploring collective alternatives to the SWIFT financial messaging network, potentially leading to fragmentation of the global payment system. Do you see China's UnionPay, for example, becoming a competitor or at least an alternative to SWIFT? And secondly, if that happens, what would the fragmentation or the division of the global financial payment system mean for the world?
Right. It's not just UnionPay. UnionPay is a credit card system. It's something the Chinese, I think the acronym is CPIS. It is meant to be, in the longer run, a substitute to SWIFT. The Chinese are very well aware SWIFT has been weaponized against Iran. It has been weaponized against North Korea. And it worries one day it will be weaponized against China. So it has been preparing alternatives. This kind of action gives them a sense, well, let's activate this alternative. And it gives them enough sort of other countries that want to be part of this alternative. So unless we put checks and balances on how SWIFT is used as a punishment device, kicking people off when you think they're behaving badly, if there are no limits on who is kicked off and when, then countries are going to say, well, China doesn't kick off anybody. It doesn't care what happens domestically. It doesn't care, it's broadly tolerant of misbehavior by countries. Let me go on to the Chinese system. Now you have two alternative systems. And then some other third country might say, well, I don't trust the Chinese, I don't trust the Americans, let me develop my own. What this does is fragment the global payment system, because the systems will not talk to each other as easily as the integrated system. But replicate this, not just in payments, but in investment, in trade. Everybody wants to have a parallel system. And there you get the fragmentation of the global system. I mean, the easiest thing to visualize is at least two large trading blocks: a democratic trading bloc, an authoritarian trading bloc. And the two don't sort of trade with each other that much because of fears of potential sanctions or fears of divisive ruptures.
The interesting corollary is that kicking countries off SWIFT may, at today's point of view, look as if it's the strength of those countries,
Yes.
but it could actually spell the death knell, or at least the ineffectiveness of SWIFT in due course.
Absolutely.
There's a seed here that could go the wrong way.
Absolutely, and this is the message which is so hard to convey, that you're reveling in newfound power, and by all means, feel good about it for a little while. But remember that once you exhibit that power, people are going to find their way around it to minimize the effect of that
And to
power.
your detriment, possibly.
And to your detriment, possibly. And that's why I keep telling people in the US, you're so, happy about militarizing, payments, but worry about the reaction it creates. And people, I've talked to former Treasury secretaries who are very worried about this prospect, that we are militarizing these things too much. And at some point, it sort of rebounds.
Well, this is
on
very
us.
interesting. There are former Treasury secretaries who are conscious of the dangers which you're discussing with me, even if the press is not bringing it up, and even if people in power are not talking about it.
They're not talking about it now. And this is, first you exercise the tool, and obviously, as I said, there is enough reason to do it. But then you start reflecting, well, what does this mean? And because once the tool is brought out, and the tool that has been most significant that was brought out this time was not so much payments, that's been used before, but was of the central bank's reserves basically being put out of use. And that tool hasn't been used before. And it is, the trend, however, is weaponizing more and more of the economic system. And that is something which obviously is possible because of globalization, because we are interlinked, but also deters further globalization.
Let's take up that particular point, because that's another aspect of your essay. And this is what you say. Following the action taken against Russia's central bank, which in turn will affect Russia's reserves, China, India, and many other countries will worry their own foreign exchange holdings of advanced economy debt may prove unusable if a few countries decide to freeze their assets. Now, I understand the fear. It's perfectly clear. And Russia has effectively lost 50% of its 600 billion assets. The question is, what can countries do to protect them? And how will those measures in turn affect the way reserves are held?
Right. So, the first impulse is, well, maybe I don't want to hold the reserves in the currencies that, where countries are most likely to act.
That's mainly the dollar, isn't it?
Well, it depends on who your greatest enemy is, right? In the case of China, obviously it's going to be concerns about the dollar, but also all the, the yen, the pound, etc. The question is, where do you go? If you can't hold the dollar, you can't hold the euro, you can't hold the yen, you can't hold the pound. Well, you can't sort of put together a bunch of ASEAN countries and their currencies and say that's what I'm going to hold, because they're not as liquid. They also tend to fall in value in bad times, unlike the dollar.
Doesn't that also apply to the yuan and the renminbi?
It does. It does. And you can't hold your own currency because that's not effective currency in buying other stuff. So one impulse is to turn to gold, but there's not enough gold, and gold is fairly illiquid also, because when you're transacting gold, you've got to actually move the physical gold, unless it's all in the Bank of England. But if it's all in the Bank of England, you have the same problem that we had earlier. The Bank of England may refuse to do transactions on your part. So unless the gold is in a common repository, it's very hard to transact gold. What does that leave you? Well, then you have to be innovative in terms of currencies. You have to put together packages of currencies. You have to hold private sector assets, which are less, the problem is many of these assets are transacted in the big financial centers, and the big financial centers
are in the West. And the sanctions will apply there.
Exactly. So then the second set of actions you can take is reduce your need for using reserves. And that becomes much more problematic. So if in India, for example, one of the reasons we have large reserves is because our corporates borrow in foreign currency, and if the dollar plunges, then their foreign currency borrowing becomes, if the dollar sort of increases in value and the rupee plunges, their dollar borrowings becomes very costly. So if we were to sort of serve as a buffer for them, we want to limit the fall in the rupee. That's part of the reason we have foreign currency reserves.
But if you don't have foreign currency reserves, then they can't borrow from abroad that easily.
And
that will affect development in India, because there may not be enough financing in India.
One. And two, it affects foreign markets which were lending to India, which can't lend anymore because we say, look, it's too dangerous to borrow in foreign currency. We're going to borrow domestically in domestic currency. And so what it does is yet another blow on global capital flows. And so again, globalization shrinks.
But there's a wonderful paradox, and it's not really hidden in what you're saying. I'm just going to spell it out for the audience. there isn't really an alternative to the world, particularly for countries with large asset holdings, other than the dollar. Because if you go for the yen or the euro or the pound, those countries are likely to impose the same sanctions as the Americans when the Americans do it. On the other hand, since there isn't an alternative, it means that you're left facing the vulnerability of being in the dollar. You don't have an alternative, but you're always going to be vulnerable if America imposes sanctions and sequesters your assets. And in a sense, I'll just finish this by putting this to you. I asked the very same question to the chief economics commentator of the Financial Times, Martin Wolf, exactly 16 days ago. And he says, this is a paradox the world is going to have to live with. The Chinese in particular are sitting upon 3.3 trillion, most of which is in dollars, and they're going to be vulnerable to whatever America does. And they can't really get out of dollars because, as you said, there aren't too many other currencies and gold isn't useful. So one's sort of caught, isn't one?
Yes and no. I mean, because then you start planning. You say, well, I can't get away from the liquid dollar. I need it for liquidity. But is there another counter threat I can apply on the dollar, on the United States?
Which is?
Why don't I invite the financial firms in? Why don't I get, Fidelity and Vanguard and BlackRock to sell stuff to my people? Why don't I get their banks to make loans domestically? They become hostages. If, the Americans act tough with respect to me, I act tough on their financial firms. There is actually a theory around this which circulates in China. It's called the theory of dual circulation. Basically, I have these two, a domestic economy and international economy. I don't want to become too dependent on the international economy. One way I develop counter threats is get the international economy to be dependent on me.
So if you want to hold me hostage, I can hold your people hostage as well.
Exactly, on something else.
And in fact, you write about this in your essay as well. I'm going to quote you. You say, a country might invite foreign banks into its market with the ulterior motive of someday holding their assets and capital hostage. That would be a hedge or a guard against America holding my assets hostage. I'll hold your BlackRock hostage.
Exactly. And, it used to be that American industrialists used to talk a lot about the need for China and America to get along because China was so essential. And over time, they got disillusioned with China. They found they weren't selling as much in China as they wanted to. They became sort of part of the faction which said we need to reset the relationship. Today, interestingly, it's the American financial firms, the Ray Dalios of the world, the Larry Finks, who are actually extolling the virtues of China in the United States. And one wonders if this is, in a sense...
Because they could be held hostage.
Well, I don't think at this point they exposed enough, but I do think they see the opportunities in China, and China welcomes them at this point. And, I don't know if this is the central motive, but at the back of the Chinese mind is, this is our insurance.
The only problem is that if you hold me hostage, I'll hold you hostage, might actually ensure that neither side holds each other hostage, provided you've got enough on each side.
Right.
But what does break down is trust. And trust is essential to the financial system. And now actually, you're operating not on the basis of trust, but on the basis of guarding against suspicion.
Right. No, but it also creates real action. So if I was an American policymaker, I would say, well, BlackRock is really getting overexposed there. And I worry that, when trust breaks down, they hold BlackRock hostage. So I'm going to have a word with BlackRock's management and tell them, hey, you guys are exposing yourself a little too much there. Why not pare it down? This is not a direct order, but it's a suggestion. My sense is countries are going to be wary about too much exposure of sensitive industries in another country, which doesn't share exactly the same value systems and beliefs.
You're talking about the sort of nudges and winks that the Bank of England famously used to use in the 30s and 40s to actually guide people without enforcing a diktat upon them.
Exactly.
A friendly word of advice
Right.
was sufficient to ensure you got the outcome you wanted.
Right.
The same thing would happen in America. The Fed would tell BlackRock, for example, hold on, you've got enough invested in China, don't go further.
Right, and it may be the Fed because you worry about the financial consequences. It may be the Treasury because you worry about political consequences. But someone in power
Will be doing it.
would whisper in your ear, look, I don't think it serves our interests.
Now, Mr. Rajan, side by side with the official sanctions that we're talking about, we've talked about economic sanctions, we've talked about financial sanctions, there is also pressure on corporations to pull out of Russia. By one count, perhaps as many as 400 have pulled out, and the big names are Visa, MasterCard, McDonald's, Starbucks, Coca-Cola, Hilton, British Petroleum, Goldman Sachs. And in your essay, you express two concerns about this. First, you say this can lead to sanctions being broadened beyond what policymakers intended. I think I understand what you're saying, but can you spell it out?
Well, one example, just in terms of fine-tuning of sanctions, is the West wants to apply sanctions on a bunch of things, but not on energy. Why? Because a higher price for energy rebounds directly on advanced countries and will affect their economy. They want to maybe do it over time, not just now. Let us develop alternative sort of sources for energy before we do that. However, in the initial application of the sanctions, even though energy was kept out, a bunch of Western buyers stopped buying Russian oil.
And BP disinvested.
Some of them disinvested for sure, but some of them stopped buying in order to feed and that created disruptions in the oil market, which of course India has benefited somewhat from by buying oil cheaper from Russia. But this is an example of an unintended consequence because of the stigma associated with doing business with Russia. You know, Shell did a perfectly legitimate by the sanctions transaction, but was pilloried for dealing with Russia and therefore backed off. So there is a widespread public mood today that, you know, no fine-tuning this stuff. Basically, do business with Russia, you're a traitor to the cause.
The danger is governments, when they impose official sanctions, know what they're targeting.
Right.
When the public mood pillories and pushes corporations,
Right.
it becomes more widespread, and the effect is not necessarily what you intended.
Exactly, and it can rebound on you also. But I think my worry is not so much, you know, you anyway wanted to cause damage and there's some spillover effects, etc. It's that, you know, this effectively can be used in other circumstances without, you know, a proper reflection on whether you want to use these weapons. And that's why I said the sort of the fact that these weapons seem to be relatively mild, when in fact they're so damaging, can cause overuse. So, for example, if I don't agree with the abortion policies in your country, will abortion activists start saying to companies, hey, you cut back on Russia. Now, why don't you cut back on this country because it has terrible abortion policies?
You've written about this. I'm going to quote you just for the sake of the audience. You say, it's not impossible to imagine a country being subjected to economic warfare because of its government's position on, say, abortion or climate change. What has been established as a precedent in the case of Russia, for reasons that are perhaps perfectly understandable, could now be abused or misused because activists say, we don't like that country's policy on abortion or climate change or whatever.
Right. And also, whenever you find weapons being used by a government, you have to ask the question, what if those same weapons were used by a different government, right? So right now everybody's clapping, saying due process was followed, the Allies discussed and then applied this to Russia. Well, what if there's a new US administration led by you-know-who, and he decides in his wisdom that he wants to apply sanctions to A, B, and C, and we have perfected the art of secondary sanctions, which is if you don't comply with my sanctions, I apply sanctions on you. And so could that imply that you have a really strong weapon of, you know, enormous power, but used without appropriate checks and balances on the user?
So it's not just the reasons why sanctions are applied that could become problematic as a result of this precedent. It's also the person who applies them.
Exactly.
Because if it's not a person that you're completely in accord with, you beautifully called him you-know-who, and I'll use the same language. I think everyone knows who we're talking about. But it would become very problematic if he were to be applying sanctions because of, let's be polite, a bee in his bonnet.
Exactly. And so I would say, you know, that creates yet a whole new aura of uncertainty around these. When will this be used? How will it be used? Will it be used because I didn't, give the you-know-who an appropriate dinner and soap him up the right way? So this is I mean, my worry about any kind of weapon is what happens afterwards. So I'm saying, okay, fine. It has been used, it has been brought out. But once it's brought out, worry going forward on what checks and balances you have on it.
This is something you actually do also address in that essay. You propose two measures to determine how economic sanctions hereafter should be used. First, you say, and I'm quoting you, because economic weapons are too powerful to leave in the hands of any one country, their use should be subject to minimal consensual requirement. Can you spell out for an audience what that minimal consensual requirement is?
Well, I'm leaving it deliberately vague, simply because I don't know. So here's the problem in some sense. The UN, the United Nations, is impotent. Because we have the 5 veto-wielding powers, if any of them wants to do something, there's no check on that. And they can prevent anybody else from interfering through the use of the Security Council veto. Now, the General Assembly can rail for all at once, but there is no real power behind that railing. There's no sanctity to any actions the UN takes without the Security Council voting. So my worry here is simply we've developed these economic sanctions as an alternative to some kind of a military effort which would be sanctioned by the UN. So let's not completely eliminate this weapon. It may be necessary going forward if there are other authoritarian dictators who decide that they want to remake the world order. At least at this point, it is in the hands of democracies and it is being used after deliberation. We can't sort of bank on that. So let's think about minimal checks and balances we have so that you know who cannot use it on his own. But what does that minimal look like without becoming another source of impotence, of being vetoed by anybody simply because...
So that minimal consensual requirement needs to be debated and discussed. We can't
Exactly.
delineate what it is today. But
I mean, I don't know. Maybe somebody else knows.
But we must begin the process of finding out and establishing.
Exactly.
But you do make one suggestion. You say there should be a gradation
Right.
of weapons use.
Yes.
And this means, you say, moves against the assets of aggressor country elites should have the highest priority and the lowest consensus requirement. In other words, whenever economic sanctions are being used as a weapon,
Right.
oligarchs should be the first target. Those measures that affect the general population should be used last of all.
Exactly. And you know, I mean, I have in mind the great hyperinflation in Germany in 1923, and that destroyed the currency. But many people also argue that destroyed the middle class, and they created the conditions ripe for the advent of Hitler. Remember, these countries that are doing these pretty awful things are often led by an authoritarian leader with very few checks and balances. And sometimes the only hope is that eventually people get sick of them and throw them out. But if you destroy the people also, there's a sense of common grievance. Oh, the West destroyed us, or the advanced countries destroyed us.
That could easily be happening in Russia without us knowing.
It could be happening, and it does create a aggrieved population, which this authoritarian has already sort of is managed. And the authoritarian has just to say, look, they're against you.
And if the middle class is wiped out, that is a class that usually is a check to the authoritarian leader.
Exactly.
If it's wiped out, populism could flow through the country to the detriment of the rest of the world.
I would say even fascism would
Even
be
fascism.
the natural consequence of this kind of thing. Strong leader leading a people who are really angry, and then, you know, all sorts of hell could break loose. So I would say be careful when you unleash these weapons which have mass impact, because the person in power has already shown a genius for capitalizing on mass behavior. And it doesn't take that much with the appropriate amount of fake news to guide the population in something more dangerous.
And the example you took of Germany in the 20s and how that led to the Nazis and Hitler is a very telling one, but it doesn't need to say much more. It's clearly delineated what a possible consequence could be
Right.
if you overdo this.
Exactly.
You make one further point. You say advanced economies should no longer turn a blind eye to the proceeds of tax evasion, corruption, and theft from elsewhere that are parked in their jurisdictions. Now, you don't name it, but I take it you have the City of London at the back of your mind.
Well, City of London, City of New York, those really high rises around Central Park. The common belief is so many apartments are empty because they're held by oligarchs around the world. But One Hyde Park in London, there are lots of names there that I think would merit careful inquiry as to where they got their wealth. But Miami, that's where a lot of the Latin American wealth is buried. So there are these havens. And interestingly, they've got a free pass for so long. We talk about the Cayman Islands, we talk about these tax havens, but we don't talk about some of these big cities, which is where a lot of wealth is buried, because it's easy and it's nice to flaunt your wealth there.
Absolutely, and there's no hiding the fact that the oligarchs have enormous wealth in Britain.
Exactly.
From football teams and houses and palaces and estates.
Right, absolutely. But the Latin American oligarchs have their wealth in Miami. So I don't think advanced countries are immune from the criticism that they have essentially created havens.
So far, advanced countries have benefited from being a place that will welcome the illegal money of oligarchs, be they Latin American or Russian.
Right.
Now they have to deny themselves that benefit because it's in their wider, deeper interest to do so.
Absolutely, or at the very least, do exactly what they've been doing on everything else, identify all those sources of wealth and be prepared to move on them. That itself may make the oligarchs a little less certain of keeping their money there.
My last question, as you yourself mentioned in an earlier answer, the West at the moment does believe that their economic sanctions, their economic weapons of mass destruction, as you call them, have got Russia backed into a corner and caught in a squeezer. Are they therefore likely to listen to your sage counsel of restraint and caution at this time? Because just when they believe their economic weapons may be delivering the result they want, you're recommending economic arms control.
Right. Obviously not. So I have the habit of saying things which are unpopular when I say them. But hopefully over time they will reflect and see the need. I mean, I work with different fora of sometimes influential people, and they certainly, the reaction I get from them is, yes, we need to. Most of them outside the US, but as I said, some people within the US also worry about the weaponization of some of their trade and investment sort of tools. And so I think over time we will see the need for this. And right now is obviously not the time because we have to see this war play out. That's why the essay sort of starts out with, after this war is over. Once it's over, we need to re-examine and see, because a lot of tools have been rolled out during this particular war. We have to see whether we've gone too far, whether we need checks and balances.
So this is a warning for what we must do when the war is over.
Absolutely.
Just because we may end up winning the war, and we don't know as yet, but presumably we will, that doesn't mean to say a review and a rethink isn't necessary. You're simply sounding a note of caution now so that when the war is over, we sit back and ask, did we do the right thing? Did we go too far? Do we need more caution before we do it all over again?
Right. When you say we, I don't know who we mean by we, but certainly for the advanced countries, if they're the we you're talking about, absolutely, that they need to reflect on how it worked out. But I want to not say that they should disarm unilaterally. What I think I would like to see is some checks and balances so that if the same coalition feels that this is the right thing to do, that they still have the ability to do it. But not if one country in that coalition sort of steps up and says we must do it. That's one. The second thing is I really hope this becomes the lever by which we re-examine the global governance system, which is completely broken, and ask again, well, do we really need these countries with vetoes? Should we have a more democratic structure? But of course, we don't want 180 countries having to vote on every issue or 200 countries having to vote. How do we recreate that system?
The last part of your answer is now broadening discussion into something much, much wider. It's to do now whether the United Nations Security Council and its vetoes needs to continue. But the earlier part was, even if we feel the sanctions have worked, and they're a preference to using actual military weapons of destruction, we need to think carefully about what they do, who they attack, what consequences lie behind them, and tailor them so that there is a way in which we're sure that they're being used in a calibrated way.
One, that, and two, that there is an appropriate degree of consensus.
Around it.
Around it, absolutely.
you know who doesn't do it alone on his own.
Yeah, after watching TV.
Raghuram Rajan, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.